Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to this Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is an absolutely gorgeous Monday in early November. Today is the 10th day of November. It is a pleasure to be with you after our traditional 5-day hiatus since last time we were together. I've been looking forward to getting back together again and with you here at the Virtual Center. We would love to hear from you. We have a phone number that is there primarily for that purpose. The telephone number, it's a relatively new one, is area code 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N, which translates into the numbers 4676. So the number, it depends on whether you like letters or numbers. I personally prefer the numbers. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you. And again, I promise that I will respond to you in kind, do the best I can to respond. If you take the time to email me, that's the least I can do. My email address is waobrien, I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. That's waobrien 906 at gmail.com. Before we get into today's program, I'm going to have to make an announcement that we will not be doing a live presentation on Wednesday. I didn't even get a chance to tell Bob Kincaid this before we went on the air. I'm going to be, I've been asked to judge a We the People competition here in the Beckley area at our courthouse, our new judicial annex, on Wednesday. And it is a competition on the Constitution, on various aspects of the Constitution, among teams from the various high schools in the local, in this school district, in this region. I've done it 2 or 3 times before, and they called and asked me if I would be willing to do it again. I think traditionally what they do is they assign us assign the judges a certain area, and they have the students are given a choice of 2 questions that they are free to develop responses to, and we're to evaluate their responses and ask follow-up questions and things like that. I really enjoy it. I really am honored, to be honest with you, that they continue to call me back each year, because with the exception of myself, I think everybody else who'll be judging is an attorney. And I don't know what that puts me in good standing or in poor standing, but be that as it may, I'm going to be in the midst of a group of attorneys on Wednesday. We're to report at 11:30, and the program will go until well after 3 in the afternoon, between 3:15 and 3:30 in the afternoon. So we'll not be able to do a program on Wednesday. I just wanted to announce that going in, for fear that I'll forget to mention it later today, and hopefully I'll remember to remind listeners tomorrow on the same thing. I'd like to. For the bulk of our program today, I'd like to return to an article on the economy that we were looking at the last time we were together. We didn't get through the article. We looked maybe at about 50-60% of it, but that was a long time ago. And I remember specifically introducing the topic by saying that I am not an economist, and there are issues raised in this article which I'm not that comfortable explaining, I guess is what I'm saying, because I really don't understand very well the world of high finance. One reason I don't is because I'm not in it. I think you got to have a few chips to ante up, so to speak. And one of the features of my life has been that no matter where I was and what I was doing, I always seemed to be a few chips short. And so consequently, much of what I know about how I financed is basically information or thing that I've tried to figure out for myself. And again, I know that there are those of you listening who are much more knowledgeable about the economy than I, and we would love to hear from you, especially if I'm wandering around making no sense at all. Then I trust that those who recognize or who can see a way to get me out of that mess would be more than willing to pick up the phone, give us a call, and do just that. Again, our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. I thought, however, before getting into that, there's another issue that actually came up this morning in my history class earlier today. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that this was probably something that belonged, at least deserved a mention, at least, here on the Virtual Center. Specifically, we were looking in class this morning, we were looking at some data. And again, given the issues related to education and education reform today, there's no question that the ability to understand data and to draw conclusions and inferences and meaning based on data is a skill that unfortunately our schools, up until now at least, have not been very good at promoting. And so consequently, one of the things that I like to do in class is when I get my hands on some data that's pertinent to a particular issue that we're dealing with in the course, I try to seize the occasion by making sure that students get a chance to wrestle with the data and learn from dealing with it, rather than me just giving my interpretation of the data. This particular data was about the institution of slavery. And this is not, I don't believe that this is anything new or revolutionary to most people. I think most people were aware of this anyway. I know I was. I didn't have the numbers. But it just so happened that the textbook that we are using in this course, which is an excellent textbook, by the way, it's called The American Pageant, and it is the 15th edition of this book, and the original author of the book, Thomas Bailey, who was an expert on foreign policy, wrote a wonderful textbook on the history of American foreign policy, and that was Bailey's strength. But Bailey passed away a few years ago, and David Kennedy, who I believe teaches at Stanford, if I'm not mistaken, had been co-editor of a number of new editions of that same book along with Bailey. And then when Thomas Bailey passed away, David Kennedy became chief editor, and he is joined by Elizabeth Cohen from Harvard as a co-editor as well. So it's one of the best textbooks available. And again, one of the reasons is that it's easy to read. It's written in a way which is much easier to read than textbooks. It's not nearly as formal. It's not chock full of hard information with no analysis or nothing human in it. This book has always featured little stories or little vignettes about people and places that make the textbook a little bit less intimidating and a little bit more inviting for students. And even though it is a textbook, and we've talked about that in the past, the fact of the matter is, a textbook by definition is a wonderful collection of information. What we have to be very, very careful of always is to separate the information from the interpretation, and make sure that we can distinguish fact from interpretation. And provided you do that, the textbooks are chock full of really good information, and so indeed is this one. I was presenting this in class this morning. We're beginning our final unit in the semester. The semester ends early in December, and so we're going to spend the next 3.5 weeks or so looking at the origins of the Civil War, the issues which brought it on, and we will not get to the Reconstruction era that followed it, but at least we'll get into the war and through the Lincoln's assassination and the proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation, and other such things. But the issue, of course, is introducing the issue of slavery itself as a way to begin this particular unit in this course. And it's always a difficult one because, very honestly, the issue of slavery is so emotional. And almost everybody has a feeling about it, and it's one of those issues where people oftentimes are inclined not to be totally honest in the way they deal with this subject, for fear that issues of racism will crop up. And so one of the things that I was sharing with the class this morning is that teachers in school have been woefully afraid of, for understandable reasons, have been really gun-shy about getting too far into the issues of slavery. They go right to the war and to the compromises and the treaties and all of that. But in terms of actually dealing with the institution of slavery itself, teachers are frequently uncomfortable with that for obvious reasons. And one of the things that I find helpful in giving people a sense of the issue and its role during this period is based on the following data. And this is the little chart that I happened to notice in this textbook. And I raised it with the students this morning, and I gave it to the students and asked them to kick it around and make sense out of it. And of course, the page on which this chart is printed in the textbook, the rest of the page itself is pretty much an analysis of what that data in that chart means. And so for learning purposes, I've made it very clear to the students that I wanted them to look at the chart, look at the data, but not get into the language or the narrative surrounding it, because in it is the author's analysis. And obviously, if you go directly to what the authors say that the data means, then you've lost a really good learning opportunity for students. So anyway, let me begin. And basically, what this data refers to is the ownership of slaves in the pre-Civil War South. These numbers all pertain to 1850. The number of white slave owners who owned 100 slaves or more in 1850 was 1,733. 1,733 slave owners owned at least 100 slaves. Those owners of slaves who owned between 50 and 100 slaves, 6,196. So four short of 6,200 owners owned anywhere from 50 slaves to 99 slaves. Those who owned between 20 slaves and 49 slaves, 29,733. So close to 30,000 owners of slaves owned between 20 and 50. Those who owned between 10 and 20 slaves, 54,595. 54,600 effectively. 54,600 owned between 10 slaves and 19 slaves. Those who owned between 5 slaves and 9 slaves, 80,765. And then finally, those who owned 1 slave, 68,820. In 1860, the number of whites living in the slave South who owned no slaves at all, as of 1860, totaled 6,120,825. So more than 6 million white Southerners did not own slaves. What that essentially means, of course, is that slaves were owned by a relatively small proportion of the white South. A very insignificant number when compared against 6,120,000 who owned no slaves. It seems to me then that a distinct majority, an overwhelming majority of white Southerners did not own slaves. So then the question, of course, that surfaces, you can't avoid it, is if so few white Southerners owned slaves, why did they fight and die to preserve an institution that didn't directly affect them? And what does that mean? And this is the discussion that we had in class this morning. And of course, one of the obvious answers that one of the students raised, which I think is quite obvious, is that if the entire culture of Southern society was built around the ownership of slaves, then one naturally would assume that the 1,700 owners of more than 100 slaves were the so-called planter aristocracy that everybody talks about. These were the leaders of the white South. These were those who packed the political and economic punch in Southern society. But the question still remains, there were more than 6 million Southern whites who didn't own any slaves. So what's their motivation for their willingness to fight and in many cases die in defense of an institution that benefited so few. And of course, when you begin to speculate on answers to that question, you of course get into the issue of racism, fear of slave revolt. One student made the point, which I thought was an excellent one, that in a culture which defines success around the ownership of slaves, then even those whites who didn't own slaves were raised in a culture which pointed towards the ownership of slaves as the definition of success. So consequently, many of those who didn't own any slaves hoped at some point in their lives to be able to. And so for Northern abolitionists to attack the institution of slavery excuse me, as immoral, as inhuman, and to question the morality of the slave owners for participating in an inhuman institution like this, to threaten to abolish the institution is really tampering with the whole social structure built around the existence of slavery. And I think that's significant. And again, the point that I'm making here on the virtual center, that there is a direction or a point that I'm making here, and it relates specifically to last week's elections, to be honest. In 1857, and of course we haven't gotten that far into this unit yet, so we were just kind of generalizing and talking generally about the issues associated with the war and the institution of slavery, and we talked about the issue of racism and how real it was and how difficult it was to measure and to pinpoint and all that. But the fact of the matter is, in 1857, 3 years before the infamous election of 1860 that elected Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States, a book written by a North Carolinian small businessman in North Carolina named Hinton Helper, Helper, entitled The Impending Crisis of the South. In that book, Hinton Helper was speaking directly to the 6+ million poor whites who didn't own any slaves. That was the audience to which Hinton Helper directed or targeted his book. And what he did in The Impending Crisis was to make the point that poor whites were really as much a victim of slavery, the institution of slavery, as were the slaves. Because, and he goes through all of the analysis associated with this, because the fact of the matter is the institution of slavery made it impossible to become successful in any other endeavor except the ownership of slaves. And that was dominated by the few who owned the most. So in a sense, what Hinton Helper was arguing was that all of the opportunity that might have been available in Southern society was being denied to poor whites because of the existence of slavery, the realities of slavery. In effect, then, what he was suggesting to poor whites is that the large slave owner is really using the institution of slavery itself in order to keep you in your place. Because all of the opportunities, all the availability of land and agricultural opportunity that might be there if slavery wasn't around for you as a hard-working individual are being denied you because the work, the productivity is being done principally by gangs of slave labor, gangs of slaves. And so consequently, your freedom, your opportunities, your chance for success in Southern society, all of those things, all of those positive things, were being denied you because of the interests of slavery, because of the institution of slavery. Therefore, Hinton Helper argued that the best thing that poor whites in the South could do for their own benefit is to engage in the toppling of the institution of slavery. It would free up opportunity, would open up opportunity in the South. Well, obviously, for reasons which we don't need to go into, but I think it's fairly obvious, the number of poor whites who read Hinton Helper's book was minimal. But the plantation owners read it, and they made sure that Hinton Helper's book was banned in the South. It was not allowed in libraries. People were not allowed to purchase it. It was banned. And of course, what a logical discussion from this information would come, a discussion from this information would come a discussion about how or why, in what ways was Hinton Helper correct? Is there validity to what Hinton Helper was arguing? Are there realities in the way societies are organized which are extremely complicated and hard to understand for a lot of people? But basically, once they are understood, there is revealed a level of injustice or unfairness to the entire way that the society is functioning, is organized. Translation: the only way that Southern power brokers, the Southern planter aristocracy, could stay in power was if poor Southern whites did not have access, let me say, to this kind of an analysis that Hinton Helper is doing. Therefore, banning his book becomes quite makes perfect sense from the perspective of the white South, because it would be inflammatory, because of the analysis, the social and political and economic analysis that is contained in it. That was basically the bulk of the class this morning, was this chart on who owned slaves and who didn't, obviously revealing that the large plantation owners were relatively few. Yet the question remains that the Confederacy did indeed fight a war for the right to leave the Union, and thousands upon thousands of white Southerners did indeed die. And of course, to the degree that slavery was an issue in the war, in spite of the fact that many people in the South continued to argue that it was the nature of the Union that was really the issue, But the extent to which slavery played a role in the war, it seems to me, would make the small number of people who owned large numbers of slaves very significant. Because in effect, that data would seem to reinforce Hinton Helper's analysis. And so consequently, it's the kind of analysis that the power structure in pre-Civil War Southern society does not want brought to the poor white. Therefore, the way to combat that is to orchestrate a campaign on slavery as a positive good and convince people, make the case that in engaging slave labor, the slave owner is actually performing a positive good, is living out his Christianity, if you will, by taking care of those unable to take care of themselves. By painting slaves as inferior and incapable of taking care of themselves, and going back to Scripture to defend the long, through history, the long history of slavery, slave owners are able to suggest strongly, to sell a point of view that the institution of slavery is a positive good, and that those who would attack it are doing so for wrong motives. And in reality, those who work in industry in the North are really wage slaves. And actually, the slave on the southern plantation is treated better and more humanely, the literature argued, than our workers in the mills of the North. So consequently, a campaign to promote and sell slavery as a positive good becomes the operative interpretation of slavery that the Southern reader is exposed to. And the racial side of that, of course, is that no matter how poor you are, if you are white, then that means there's somebody lower than you are. In a sense, the psychology here is you may be poor, but as long as you're white, you have a status in society significantly better than the slave. So the emphasis on the race issue becomes part and parcel of this whole issue. Why do I take time here at the Virtual Center on this Monday, the first program of the week, to deal with this particular issue as it occurred in a history class this morning? It didn't occur to me at the time, but since my class this morning, and reflecting upon it, it did begin to occur to me to the point that I really thought it worthwhile to bring it here to you at the Virtual Center. And it's this. The whole structure of Southern society is pretty much a blur to most citizens of the South, to the so-called, to the 6+ million non-slave-holding whites in pre-Civil War society. Consequently, what Hinton Helper is doing is performing or providing an analysis of society and the way it works, which suggests that the process is basically unfair to certain people. It's a very sophisticated analysis of society. It's a level of analysis that not all that many people are capable of doing. It's the kind of analytical skill, if you will, or critical thinking skill that people are criticizing our education system for ignoring. I guess what I'm suggesting here is a possible link between ignoring critical thinking from our education, from our classrooms, and banning Hinton Helper's book from the pre-Civil War South. In last Tuesday's election, it appears that many people, for some reason, some strange reason, seem to be voting against their own best interests. I'm in West Virginia, and I can speak pretty, about West Virginia maybe a little bit more knowledgeably than I can other states. But no question, West Virginia became a red state last Tuesday. Both houses of the legislature are under control of Republicans, of the Republican Party, for the first time in 100 years. While the governor remains a Democrat, the question is going to be whether, in fact, another Democrat will be elected governor, or whether, in fact, the degree of redness in West Virginia will pass to the governor's office at the time of the next election. West Virginia has had Republican governors. In fact, Governor Cecil Underwood was governor on two separate occasions in recent years. He was first elected in the 1960s. He was the youngest governor in West Virginia's history up to that time. And then in the 1990s, he was reelected again to another four-year term as governor, and he was the oldest governor to ever sit in the governor's mansion in West Virginia. So Cecil Underwood basically had the honor of being both the youngest and the oldest governor in the state's history. He was a Republican. But he worked with solidly Democratic legislatures, both houses of the legislature. But now, as of last Tuesday, that whole situation is reversed. Not only that, but the polls, well before the elections, predicted that West Virginia would become a red state in this election. The race for the United States Senate, for the seat being vacated by the retirement of Jay Rockefeller, was almost a closed book. It was predicted to be so one-sided in favor of the Republican candidate, Sheila Moore Capito, who is the daughter of another Republican governor of West Virginia, who was governor in the 1970s, Arch Moore. But her victory was predicted to be a landslide, and indeed it was. So the question is being raised is, when's the last time West Virginia ever sent a Republican senator to the United States Senate? In talking to people about the results of the election, many people have said to me, how could people in West Virginia vote overwhelmingly Republican like this when the Republican Party wants to privatize Social Security, when it was the Democratic Party that instituted Social Security, when it's the Democratic Party that instituted health care? There are approximately 118,000 West Virginians who now have health care that didn't have it 12 to 15 months ago. And yet, despite all of that, West Virginians voted for a change. And I'm wondering, is it because West Virginians really don't understand the nature of the state and the economy they live in? Are they as uninformed about the world that they function in as were poor whites prior to the Civil War in the South? Just as the non-slave-holding white Southerner understood slavery from a particular point of view which was being fed to him over and over again, so also West Virginians last Tuesday bought into a myth, I believe a myth, that the change to Republican government in West Virginia is the surest avenue towards jobs and towards the protection of the coal industry from President Obama, who's outspokenly engaging in a so-called war against coal. And so many people in West Virginia believe that all the things that the Republican Party stands for will benefit them. In effect, coal has had the same impact on West Virginia and the West Virginia economy as slavery had on the pre-Civil War South. It guaranteed that West Virginia will remain, as long as West Virginia remains a coal state, it remains an extractive economy. It remains an economy based on jobs, extracting resources, and shipping the wealth associated with those resources outside the state. And much of the economic situation in West Virginia, 49th in this and 50th in that and 47th in something else, many of these negative numbers of West Virginia and where it ranks in comparison to other states are directly connected to the role that coal has played in the West Virginia economy over the last century. It has made diversification of the economy impossible. Coal has been able to establish an inordinate influence over the legislature, over West Virginia politics. Therefore, government policy, state policy, has always been favorable to the coal companies because everything had to pass their muster before it could be enacted. So therefore, the relationship between coal and government in West Virginia has always been a close-knit one. And the result has been that our education system is deficient, our economy is deficient, there's very little economic diversification, And as technology has wiped out a significant number of coal jobs, the campaign to build a positive culture around the idea that to be a West Virginian you must be a friend of coal. This campaign is very, very similar to the campaign that white Southern slave masters orchestrated in selling the institution of slavery as a positive good, when in fact historically many of those directly involved in the institution of slavery were convinced that it had to end. The person I'm thinking of specifically here is Thomas Jefferson. There's a very famous statement Ralph Waldo Emerson made about slavery, and it goes something like, when you put a chain around the neck of a slave, you put the other end around your own. Because in effect, the institution of slavery became such a dominant force in Southern culture that it made all else secondary and unimportant. It inhibited change. It destroyed opportunity. It made freedom nothing more than a word, because there was no opportunity associated with one's freedom. So even if you were free because you were white, there was nothing you could do meaningfully with that freedom other than leave. Coal has had a similar impact on West Virginia's economy through the years. And yet we have the results of last Tuesday's election, and one wonders what happened. Why would people vote that way? As a member of the Republican Party in the Congress of the United States over the last 2 or 3 terms, the woman recently elected Republican senator last Tuesday to replace Jay Rockefeller, Sheila Moore Capito, cast her vote along with other Republicans in the House at least 50 times to abolish the Affordable Care Act, and voted repeatedly again to privatize Social Security. But that was not the issue. Those were not the issues in the campaign. There was no West Virginia version of Hinton Helper. But of course the irony is, Hinton Helper's message was to the poor white community in the South. They never got it. For reasons which is really another program about the kind of education that people receive and don't receive. The average person is not going to be able to understand this kind of social and political analysis unless he's taught how to do it. That's the essence of educational reform. That's in the list of objectives in the so-called Common Core standards. One has to wonder to the degree to which opposition to the Common Core standards may in fact lie right there in what it promises to do for the individual in terms of the individual's abilities to understand things they never were able to understand before. It's that connection in my mind that prompted me to take our time here at the virtual center today on this particular issue. I think it is very, very important. I think it says an awful lot. It says a lot about history. It says a lot about the ability to analyze or interpret data. It says an awful lot about education. says an awful lot about the relationship between politics and the economy. Says quite a bit about the media. Says quite a bit about the election campaigning system that is clearly alive and well in our American polity, as it were. All of that, I think, has a place here at the Virtual Center. It is now 51 minutes after the hour. We've gone pretty much 9 minutes short of an entire hour on this particular topic. I knew it would take a little bit of time, but I think it is such an important issue, and it is so telling. Something just occurred to me related to this, which I hadn't really thought about during the entire program until just now. And it's the nature of this kind of an analysis. I remember one time, about 2 years ago, I was working on some narrative. I was working on a book with a friend that I thought we were going to do. It turned out that I wasn't able to do it. I just didn't have the time or whatever. But I was working out the introductory portions of it in the narrative, and I wrote what I thought was a pretty good narrative. And I think I've actually shared pieces of it here at the Virtual Center in the past. And I shared it with a friend of mine, a good friend of mine. And when he got it back, his response is, "You know that this is a Marxist analysis." And I hadn't really thought about that. And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, what you're doing is you're making a distinct connection between politics and the economy. That you're linking, you're basically suggesting a relationship which hasn't been all that positive between government and the economy and the people who drive the economy." And I said, "Is there anything wrong with the analysis?" And he said, "Oh, no, I think you're right on. But you need to know that it's Marxist." And I said, "What exactly am I supposed to make of that?" And of course, the fact that after I thought about it for a while, the fact of the matter is, when you label it Marxist, it causes any number of people to say, "Oh, I'm not going to read this crap. I'm not going to read this stuff." And so it so happens that because of the label, the content never gets shared or never gets delivered. It's kind of like the idea of community. Community is so important. But out of the word community comes the word communism. And if you associate those who put an emphasis on community with those we call communists, then you immediately delegitimize the substance of what they're saying or trying to say. And it's yet another version, or another example, if you will, of a Hinton Helper-like situation. And the situation of massive amounts of out-of-state money, big money, pouring into our local elections, as well as your local elections, because they were everywhere. This outside money, $4 billion spent on this. At least that's the number that I've seen thrown around for last Tuesday's election. $4 billion. Think of what you can do in an economy with $4 billion. And basically, it was designed to promote an agenda, principally by attacking the alternative agenda. And the vast majority, given the results of the election, it appears that a vast majority of the American electorate bought it. So I wonder, It is now 55 minutes after the hour. We've got about 5 minutes before we take our break. Let me at least shift gears here and begin the process of revisiting an article that we were looking at last time we were together here at the Virtual Center. The title of the article is The Zombie System, How Capitalism Has Gone Off Its Rails. The author, Michael Sauga, S-A-U-G-A. The source, translation from Spiegel Online, which is in Germany. And basically, what this particular piece does is provide some background and analysis on today's economic situation in the developed world, which at a minimum raises eyebrows, because in 2 or 3 places through this article it predicts the next crash. In fact, one of the quotations in here is former Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, who made the comment that the next crash is inevitable. The only question is when. How long? And this particular article is an analysis of the economy designed to explain why there is so much concern about the nature of the industrialized economy, the industrialized West, if you will. And we got into this last week, but the article begins by pointing out there's really something rotten in Denmark, so to speak. There's something wrong in our economic outlook. The people who know it best are worried. And what they worry about more specifically than anything is the idea of inclusion in Western industrialized economies. The word inclusion, as it's used here in the economic sense, refers to a practice or a trait in Western industrialized nations which is designed to bring as many layers of society as possible into economic development and into active participation in the nation's political life. Translation. Translation, the more people who are involved in the economy and whose lives are benefiting from it, the stronger the economy. So the buzzword, as used here, is the word inclusion. And what is really concerning the experts, the economic experts from around the world, is that increasingly in Europe, in Japan, in the United States, the word inclusion is becoming less and less a factor in the structure of Western industrialized economies. In May, and I believe we touched on this last time, in May there was a World Economic Conference in London. 250 of the wealthiest individuals in the world attended this conference, including the chairman of Google, Eric Schmidt, CEO of Unilever, Paul Polman, Bill Clinton, and one of the people there was the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde. And to a person, they were critical and concerned about the direction that the world's economies are going in. Bill Clinton talked about the uneven distribution of opportunities, of economic opportunity in these economies. Christine Lagarde talked about the numerous financial scandals that have arisen around the world. And Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, prominent world investor, said that she was concerned about social cohesion because citizens, quote, have lost confidence in their governments, unquote. It appears that the Western economy is stagnant. Growth is happening, but it's minimal growth. It's not nearly as fast or as deep as we would like it. And we have to remember that it's 6 years since the recession of 07-08. It's 6 years since Lehman Brothers crashed. And yet many of those people who were really hurt during the recession lost their homes, lost their jobs, had their savings wiped out, their retirement savings wiped out. Many of these people have found it unable to rebound because economic growth has been so slow and so measured. And the worst part of it is many of the things that we believe caused the recession, cheap money, speculation, debt, all of the things that we hear talked about all the time, are still with us. In other words, no reforms have meaningfully changed anything since the recession. Consequently, these people are able to predict that we might be in for another one. That's the article that we were into last time here at the Virtual Center. And after we do pause for a 5-minute break, I'd like to return, and hopefully we can make sure that we complete this article before the end of our time together today. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. The time is 3 minutes after the hour. In the East, 3 minutes after 2 Eastern Standard Time, as of last weekend, you'll remember. This is Bill O'Brien, and please stay with us. We'll take a short break, and we'll be right back. Thank you. Welcome back to our second hour here at the Virtual Center. This is Bill O'Brien, and again, this is the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I think, just a quick reference to the first hour of today's program. It was a kind of an effort to touch on the issues of civic responsibility. And I think becoming educated is a key part of fulfilling that civic responsibility. Thank you for your willingness to join us here at the Virtual Center. If you have been with us through the first hour, we thank you for staying with us. If you are just joining us, welcome to today's program. It's an absolutely gorgeous day. We are on the cusp, as I'm sure you know from the long-range forecasts, in the middle of this week to quite a cold snap that seems to be headed into the 48 states and will take over pretty much the entire nation, except, from what I understand, except for the state of Florida. So I think we're all in for a little bit of taste of winter. Some of us obviously will get a little bit bigger taste than others. But in the meantime, today is gorgeous, and tomorrow, at least here, they're predicting it'll be even nicer. We're going to be up in the upper 60s tomorrow, and then the anvil will fall, the hammer will fall, so to speak, on Wednesday. We would love to hear from you here at the Virtual Center if you have comments or commentary on issues we've talked about or issues we hope to talk about. We would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N, 4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. impendingcrisis.com. If you are just joining us, let me kind of orient you a little bit to today's program. We just began to consider this article that was sent by a listener. The link was sent last week by a listener to me. It is from Spiegel online and translated from the original German. It is about the economy, the Western economy, and it is entitled The Zombie System, How Capitalism Has Gone Off the Rails, so to speak. And we had just begun to consider this particular article at the top of the hour. So if you are just joining us, you are getting in right at the very, very beginning. We were talking about a meeting, a world financial meeting held in London in May of this year, in which many of the most prominent, wealthiest individuals in the world were in attendance. And many of them were worried about the direction that the Western economies are headed in. And the issue that seemed to be in the forefront of the concerns was the issue of inclusion, or more particularly, the growing lack of inclusion in the economies of the various nations in the industrialized world. The realization, and I think one of the attendees, Lynn Forster, the Rothschild, talked about the extent to which citizens have lost confidence in their governments because of a concern about social cohesion. In other words, what really concerned her was the reality, the realization that an economy based on inclusion, on incorporating as many layers of society as possible into the vibrant economy, helps to hold society together. It becomes a form of social glue. It gives all of us a common concern, if you will, or common interests, because all of us depend on the economy. Therefore, all of us will do whatever we can do to make sure that the economy stays strong and hopefully becomes even stronger. And what worried these people at this conference was that they were beginning to see this sense of inclusion in the world's economies disappearing. And instead, the economies of some of the biggest, most vibrant economies in the world seem to be stagnant. One of the concerns expressed at this conference was that governments and business leaders in the various nations are calling for growth initiatives, for jobs. I mean, how many times in the last election, everybody and every candidate in the world was promising jobs. But the fact of the matter is, who and how, who can deliver and how? Because, as this article points out, governments pretty much don't have much to rely on any longer, because they spent billions on stimulus packages in 2007 and 2008 in order to stem the financial crisis. And the result is that these governments are looking at huge debt. Consequently, the calls for economic stimulus and growth initiatives are falling on deaf ears, because basically governments have run out of money, at least the kind of money that they feel would be necessary in order to provide the kind of economic stimulus that's being called for. The difference is, and this is the key, I think, to the whole issue. The difference is that while billions of dollars were spent in finding ways to stimulate the economy in order to end the recession, the fact of the matter is most of these dollars didn't end up doing anything for the economy. That basically what they ended up doing is pumping money into the financial sector. But putting it there is not putting it into the economy. Governments have tried to help out by keeping interest rates low, near zero. Consequently, they spent hundreds of billions of dollars buying government bonds. Yet the money that they are pumping into the financial sector of the economy isn't making its way into the economies themselves. And I'm going to read from the text here, because I don't think I can say it any better. Be it in Japan, Europe, or the United States, companies are hardly investing in new machinery or factories anymore. Instead, prices are exploding on the global stock market, real estate market, and bond markets. A dangerous boom driven by cheap money, not by sustainable growth. So the economy, if you look at the Dow Jones, look at the stock markets, the bond markets, it looks like the economy is very strong. But the fact of the matter is, these signs on the markets, the bond markets and the stock markets, is not equivalent, is not the same thing as stimulating the economy. This is a boom that is driven by cheap money, not by sustainable growth. Therefore, the experts are seeing very worrisome signs. More important, workers' wages are stagnating, while the wealthier people, the people whose money is working for them in investments, are making a fortune. And it's causing a wider and wider gap in society. It's splitting society rather than bringing it together. The Boston Consulting Group reported that private wealth grew by about 15% last year, twice as fast as in the previous year. So the few are making it big. The many are not making it at all. Basically, the author points out that this data, this kind of economic data, reveals a dangerous malfunction in capitalism's engine room. Banks, mutual funds, and investment firms used to ensure that citizens' savings were transformed into technical advances, growth, and new jobs. Today, these investment firms organize the redistribution of social wealth from the bottom to the top. The middle class is stagnating. Harvard economist Larry Katz uses the following example to explain the situation. He says U.S. society has come to resemble a deformed and unstable apartment building. The penthouse at the top is getting bigger and bigger. The lower levels are overcrowded. The middle levels are full of empty apartments, and the elevator has stopped working. In other words, if you look at the economy around this model of the deformed apartment building, the whole thing is broken. It's not working the way it was intended to work. And it's being reflected in people's response about the economy. In Germany, for example, 90% feel that the gap between rich and poor is getting wider and wider. Many people feel that their countries are no longer being governed by parliaments and by legislatures, but rather by bank lobbyists. And that the bank lobbyists are operating on what the author of this article calls the logic of suicide bombers. Either they are rescued or they drag the entire economy to its death. I'd like to pause here for a moment. There's reference here to Thomas Piketty's very popular book now on the economy, where Piketty argues that the unequal distribution of wealth and income is an inherent factor in capitalism itself, that it's not a phenomenon that is just happening at a certain point in time, but rather it's inherent, it's systemic in the nature of capitalism itself. Obviously, it's a leftist analysis of the economy. But as we mentioned last hour, it may be leftist, but does that mean it's wrong? The implication, of course, of the use of the term leftist is that it's suspect because it's leftist. The fact of the matter is it may be real. There's no question that Hinton Helper's analysis of pre-Civil War Southern society was leftist also, but it was on target. And it was so much on target that the book itself was banned. Mike Mayo, who was one of the few people on Wall Street who predicted the recent recession, spends most of his time focusing on the banks themselves. And I remember last time when we dealt with this article, we mentioned Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter. And Schumpeter defined banks as guarantors of progress, which Schumpeter described as creative destruction. And this is the old idea, the model, that businesses are constantly undergoing change. Some of them are dying, but new ones are being born all the time. And it's that kind of economic action, economic activity, that defines or reveals or reflects a vibrant economy, a growing economy. But the fact of the matter is, I apologize for the phone in the background. Let me quote directly from the article because this is Mayo talking. Banks, as he studies them, financial institutions, have not really performed the creative destruction function that Schumpeter talked about for a long time. Before the financial crisis, they were the drivers of untenable expansion of debt that caused the crash. It was the financial institutions themselves, the banks, the holding companies, that were making debt available, a huge expansion of debt before the crash. Now, because they're focused on repairing the damage from the recession, they're actually inhibiting the recovery because instead of the banks and financial institutions making the money available to revive the economy, they're doing just the opposite. They aren't engines of growth anymore, Mike Mayo says, because they're afraid to lend. And so what we have is, it seems like, an international economic system that appears to be in serious trouble. In this article, the author addresses Switzerland. Switzerland, as we know, is the place where the world's wealthy used to store their assets in Swiss banks. For decades, Switzerland was based on a unique form of capitalism which promised small craftsmen as many benefits as those who worked in high finance. Switzerland was the tax haven for the world's wealthy. And basically, it also had some of the highest salaries in Europe. But the recent recession is changing all of that, according to the author of this article. The country's established class consensus was shattered by the excesses of the financial crisis. The $60 billion bailout of Switzerland's biggest bank, UBS, United Bank of Switzerland, and the millions of dollars in golden parachutes paid out to executives so that they wouldn't go to work for their competitors. The result was that the consensus that had existed within the Swiss economy is no more. Consequently, what's happening in Switzerland now is a series of popular initiatives similar to what we hear in the United States that are being termed anti-business. The Swiss, for example, voted to put a cap on what they call rip-off salaries. Another referendum put a ceiling on executive compensation. Another proposal was designed to support government pensions with the imposition of a new tax on large inheritances. And this is the section that makes reference to what we called last time the wealth of the medieval princes. Income isn't the problem in Switzerland, where the gap between rich and poor is no wider than in Germany or France. The problem is assets. No other country has as many major stockholders, financiers, and investors as Switzerland has. And in no country is as much capital concentrated in so few hands. The assets of the 100 wealthiest Swiss citizens have increased fivefold in the last 25 years. In Zurich, the 10 richest residents own as much as the poorest 500,000 residents. Wealth has become so concentrated in Switzerland, the author says, that it rivals the wealth of medieval princes. But, and this is the key, government benefits not at all from all this wealth. The Swiss tax authorities collected a total last year of 864 million Swiss francs in inheritance tax. And the chances are that it's not going to increase. To attract wealthy individuals, Switzerland has reduced tax rates to such low levels that even estates worth billions can be left to the next generation without being subject to any tax at all. And it's what we call in this country, it's the same thing as we call in this country the death tax, the inheritance tax, capital gains, inheritance tax. And so there's a consensus or a move afoot in Switzerland to find a way to force the wealthy to pay more taxes. One of the leaders of the movement is a businessman named Wenger. Let me get his Marcus Wenger. He owns a window factory in Switzerland, and he's very active in the movement. And the point of the article is he's not a revolutionary. He's a big fan of the market economy. But the problem is, he says, that he pays £8,000 a year in Social Security contributions for a carpenter who makes 65,000 Swiss francs. But the Swiss population is aging, so contributions to pension insurance threaten to increase drastically. Doesn't it make sense, Wenger asks, to extract an additional contribution from those Swiss citizens who pay hardly any taxes at all on their growing fortunes? In other words, if the cost of pensions, of taking care of the elderly, is going to increase dramatically in the coming years, why shouldn't everybody pay their fair share? Is that leftist? Is it Marxist? Is it just? I think that's the question that Marcus Wenger, is asking. And the fact of the matter is, he points out that an awful lot of his business colleagues don't agree with him. They're primarily driven by profit. And Wenger predicts that in the end, the vote will be 60-40 against us. And then this article, and this is where we stopped last time, and then this article goes into one David Stockman. Many of us, of course, will remember David Stockman as the manager of finance in the Reagan administration in the 1980s. He was the face of the Reagan Revolution, David Stockman. He was the architect of the biggest tax cut in U.S. history, and he was the lead propagandist for the idea of trickle-down, the Republican idea that profits earned by the rich eventually benefit the poor, on the assumption that they are reinvested into the economy. And this whole article is intended to point out that that's not what's happening at all. 30 years later, today, Stockman is sitting on a Chesterfield sofa in his enormous mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, where the hedge fund folks live, a suburb of New York, and private security companies have parked on every street corner, the author says. Stockman is moving from his mansion in Greenwich to an apartment in New York City, in Manhattan. The article points out that Stockman's life took him through the executive suites of Washington politics and the U.S. financial industry, and has put him in an unparalleled position to recount American capitalism over the last 3 decades. Stockman says, quote, "We have a financialized, central bank-dominated casino that is undermining the fundamentals of a healthy, growing capitalist economy," Stockman says. Stockman obviously believes in free markets, but he has turned against those who advocate the very policies that he helped initiate under President Reagan in the 1980s. Stockman left the Reagan administration when the administration took a strong position against any tax increases after the '84 elections. He knew then that what he wanted to happen in the economy could not happen, and he began to disassociate himself from his party. He says the Republican concept of starving the beast is the worst thing in terms of fiscal rectitude that you can imagine. It's even worse than the Keynesian model of the Democrats. So now Stockman is arguing against the idea of starving the beast, starving government. Obviously, Stockman has turned on those who were orchestrating the Reagan Revolution. You'll remember that Stockman served at the same time as Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan. And Greenspan's whole idea was to keep interest rates low in order to make low interest money available theoretically for economic expansion. However, Stockman points out it didn't have that result. the cheap money that was available through low interest rates primarily became what this article calls a sweet poison for Wall Street. Stockman entered the field of leverage buyouts. He became wealthy again because of his success in the leverage buyout, the kind of financial deal where the investor buys companies with borrowed money, restructures them or carves them up, and then sells them at a profit. If you remember, that's exactly the same kind of financial business that I'm stuck for a name here. Mitt Romney was involved in, in his business, was the leveraged buyout. These deals made Stockman rich, but they also, according to this, turned him into a junkie because he became caught up in the idea of the buyouts. Let me read this because this is information that I did not know. Disaster struck David Stockman in 2007 when one of his highly leveraged companies went bankrupt. He was indicted on fraud charges, and the bankruptcy cost him millions and damaged his reputation. He says it became his road to Damascus experience. And a short time after that, the financial crisis hit everybody. Stockman concluded that the very same mistakes that had destroyed his company also took the United States to the brink of financial disaster. Cheap credit, excessively high debt, and a false sense of security that everything would ultimately work out for the best. Once again, Stockman became a rebel and turned on those that he formerly worked with. He gave up his position in the financial industry and now authors a blog on the internet and recently has published an 800-page analysis of what he calls the great deformation of U.S. capitalism. Stockman is furious over the country's transformation into what he calls a debt republic of the sort that the Western world has never seen before. A republic in which going to college is paid for with borrowed money, as is the next military campaign. A country which hasn't actually dismantled its gigantic pile of debt since the crisis, $60 trillion, but has merely redistributed the debt. While the banks were allowed to pass on a large share of their bad loans to taxpayers, the government is in more debt than ever before. And the reason, and I remember during the 2007-2008 TARP years, if you remember the temporary, the TARP program started in his last year by George W. Bush. And the government they were actively recruiting what they called shovel-ready projects. Projects which would immediately turn into job-producing ventures. In other words, the idea of the stimulus was to stimulate the economy. The fact of the matter is, little stimulation of the economy really happened. Instead, much of the money went into the financial sector, and it was used for the purchase of bonds and stocks and all the rest of it, and the economy itself was left to languish. The primary beneficiaries of the recent market rally, and you remember the market now is up near 17.5, the Dow, the primary beneficiaries of this market rally seen in recent months are the 10% of top earners who own more than 90% of the nation's financial assets. For average Americans, the policies instituted in response to the financial crisis have been poverty-inducing. Millions of U.S. citizens first lost their homes, then their jobs. Now the divide in the country is as big between rich and poor as it was in the 1920s. While wealth has gone to those at the top, the average household, median household, has become $50,000 poorer since 2007. There's no possibility of a soft landing, David Stockman says. There will be some great conflagration. It's just the question of when. So Stockman, along with Robert Rubin, is predicting the next crash. This article then goes into the European Central Bank, which is performs the same function in Europe with the euro as the Federal Reserve does here. And the point it is making is that the European Central Bank controls interest rates and controls the money supply just as the Fed does here. And it drives the prices on both on the stocks as well as financial markets. And consequently, there's a fear that the European Central Bank has all but replaced the European bond market. And so the people who know the best are predicting another recession, another crash, if you will. And this is the title of this article, The Zombie System. In Europe, the process has dragged on for years under pressure from financial lobbies. The condition of the financial industry is now so dismal that experts are using metaphors from horror films to describe what they call zombie banks. These are the banks that are being kept alive artificially by government bailouts, and like zombies in Hollywood films, are wreaking havoc throughout Europe. They're too sick to lend money to the real economy, but healthy enough to speculate with financial investments. So what is happening, and this is the way I understand it. I mentioned at the beginning of today's program that please call if you can correct me, but it seems to me that what we're seeing is rampant runaway speculation in the market. Businesses, corporations are not investing in growth and expansion and in jobs. Rather, they're rewarding stockholders. The value of their stock is going up and up and up. And their priority is regular, periodic measures of increases in the value of their stock. And so the profit that they are making is not being reinvested back into the economy. It's going into the purchase of more stock or into sometimes shaky investments. In a sense, what that means is many of the people in our economy with the most ability and the most talent are playing games by moving money around. But they aren't making anything. They aren't contributing anything. They aren't doing anything to promote an expansion of our economic system. And this is the conclusion. This particular issue is really the conclusion of this article, and it's the one thing I wanted to make sure we got to today. One of the 10 most influential economists in the world is a man named Darren Acemoglu, Acemoglu, Acemoglu. He's from Turkey, Istanbul. He became famous 2 years ago when he and a colleague, James Robinson, published a deeply researched study on the rise of Western industrial societies. Their central thesis was that the key to their success was not climate or religion, but the development of social institutions that included as many citizens as possible, a market economy that encourages progress and entrepreneurship, and a parliamentary democracy that serves to balance interests. This is the study that Acemoglu and James Robinson released 2 years ago on the development, on the emergence of Western industrial societies. And I'm repeating here, what their conclusion was that what made these Western industrial economies successful was not necessarily climate, it wasn't religion. It was the fact that around industrial development emerged the kind of society or social institutions that included large numbers of citizens into the economy by encouraging progress and investment, creativity, entrepreneurship, and a parliamentary democracy to keep everything balanced. The Western industrial economies took off. Acemoglu says the only problem with that is that these institutions, these social institutions, don't just happen, they have to be built. They have to be promoted and they have to be defended. Essentially, protected against those people, those groups, that would use their power to seal themselves off from their competitors, to secure their own benefits and seek to influence lawmakers, the politicians. So in other words, you don't need a government that stands off and is not involved in the economy. You've got to have a government that's actively involved in managing the economy in order to ensure that there is balance within different sectors of the economy. The result is that it includes large numbers of people in your society. It gives everybody a vested interest in a growing, vibrant economic system, and everybody benefits. It's kind of like a rising tide raises all boats. But his point is that these things need to be created and defended and promoted. They don't just happen. He cites dozens of cases throughout history. 14th century Venice, for example, where a small patrician class monopolized trade. Egypt under Mubarak. In other words, these are examples when the economy ceases to be inclusive and becomes the product of the possession or the property, if you will, of a small group of people. When that happens, and this group is able to acquire political clout to keep government out of the equation, out of the picture, the result is that the vibrancy in the economy disappeared. The question, are Western industrial societies currently undergoing a similar process of extraction as happened in Egypt under Mubarak, as happened in Venice in the 14th century? On the one hand, this is Acemoglu talking. On the one hand, he says, the United States is more inclusive today than it was in the 1960s because it has abolished racial segregation. On the other hand, he says, he has noticed the growing influence of powerful interest groups, the pharmaceutical industry, insurance companies, and most of all, Wall Street. Quote, The problem of money in politics, as Samaglu says, is particularly acute in the case of the financial industry, unquote. I think we've seen within last Tuesday an example of the issue, the results of money in politics. U.S. politicians spend up to 70% of their time raising money for their campaigns. Wall Street is one of the major sources of that money. Wall Street is buying influence in Washington and in the state capitals of the, of the various states, the respective states. Consequently, government has ceased to promote or serve the common interest or the public interest, and has instead become a representative for these private interests. He says it's not bribery, it's self-interest of these groups. One example that he provides is recently in Germany, and I remember this. Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany moved quickly to prevent the Greek, if you remember when the Greek government looked like it was going to go bankrupt last year. She took the lead in preventing Greek insolvency. But Asamoglu points out most of that was because German banks invested in Greece. So her goal was not to save the Greek economy so much as it was to rescue the banks, the German banks that had taken up residence there. So he says it's not bribery, it's basically self-interest and political interest. Limiting that kind of influence of banks and financial institutions, Asamoglu believes, is the most important thing, so that today's upper-class, high-finance capitalism can once again revert to being a capitalism of the real economy and the social and the societal center. In other words, the economy itself has become the property of a very, very small group of people who have been able to buy financial and political interest, political capital, if you will, and government has ceased to fulfill its legitimate role as a balancer of interests in managing a society, and has instead become the agent for the few. What is needed, Asamoglu believes, is a new political alliance that takes a stand against the power of the financial industry and its lobby. What Asamoglu is talking about is a return to the progressive movement of the early 20th century, the antitrust movement that is associated with Theodore Roosevelt is the model that he talks about. He says it was a broad coalition from the center of society that finally achieved its great victory after decades of struggle, the breakup of major corporations like Standard Oil. And he closes by saying solutions to the world's problems are not produced in a meeting between Bill Gates and George Soros. Renewal has to come from below. The reason that I wanted to bring this article to the virtual center is because I think it puts into context many of the issues, especially the financial and economic issues, that we continually make reference to here, and many of us struggle with. It puts a lot of it into context. It seems, the author here seems to be able to point out where we've gone off track. And of course, I call your attention to the title of this article, How Capitalism Has Gone Off the Rails. The financial institutions, the banks, that used to drive the economy are now driving the bond markets. They're investing in stock. And the value of the companies and the value of the stock of the companies seems to be the most significant and important measure of success. And consequently, there's no room for the masses of the people that are necessary to make a market economy go. And so consequently, many of the rest of us, if you will, are falling by the wayside, are dropping out of the equation. We're not involved in the game anymore. It used to be in the 1920s, I remember reading from history that Wall Street investors were worried because proportionally so few Americans were invested in the stock market. The concern during the 1920s was Bolshevism, Soviet communism, and the threat to capitalism that communism seemed to pose. The solution to meeting that threat was, in the mind of many, if the more Americans we can get to invest in the stock market, the more effective we'll be in thwarting the expansion of communism. Because people who own a piece of the action are not going to jeopardize the game, the action itself, the game. And as we know, over the years, larger and larger percentages of Americans have all of their retirement money vested in stocks, in the stock market. But the 12 and 14 and 16% returns that attracted so many of us to the stock market are now only there for the heavy hitters. Many of us, and I include myself in this, are people that because the market at times is so shaky, take the guaranteed 3% return in order to protect our investments. And the money that's being generated on the market is going to fewer and fewer people who have successfully speculated and are buying up the assets. There is so little associated with all of this that involves economic development or economic growth. There's so very, very little of our initiatives or our efforts that are going into expanding the economy. Companies, CEOs, profiteers are taking money out of the ventures and are stashing it in overseas locations to avoid taxes. So in other words, the biggest measure of financial success is measured in dollars to these people, when in fact the people who really know realize that the real success of this system is its ability to satisfy and to support huge proportions of the population. But because of the changes that are underway, the whole nature of the game has changed. I don't feel, there's no way in the world I could have written this article because I don't understand it that well. But I do remember, I almost feel a little bit prophetic here. I do remember pointing out to classes that I've taught in recent years that most of our brightest people in college, for example, our best graduates are going into finance, are going into the law. They are going into the areas where they manipulate and play with money. They are not going into manufacturing. They're not going into business. They're not going into the kinds of industries that employ people. Rather, they become manipulators of capital. And you can't sustain an economy that way. Even I knew that. And now, after reading this article as carefully as we have, I think I'm beginning to understand where many of the problems are. However, in the back of my mind, looming right there, is last Tuesday's election. Because one of the things we did last Tuesday was give a rousing vote of confidence to those people whose financial priorities are in this very same direction. We have reached the end of our program today. It's 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for being with us here at the Virtual Center. Tomorrow, you'll recall, we'll begin 1/2 hour late. We'll begin at 1:30 in the East, and there will be no program on Wednesday. So tomorrow will be our final program this week. For the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility, this is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so very much. Look forward to getting it together again tomorrow. Thank you.